Hello, bonjour, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from in the world. Welcome to the symposium. And this is a panel that is on meaningful civic engagement with data and artificial intelligence. My name is Nick Luca. I'm a professor at McGill University, and I'm the Associate Director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Montreal, which is hosting this very exciting event. And we're delighted to welcome our distinguished panel. Just a quick word about the center. We are committed to fostering the development of concrete projects that, while taking advantage of the knowledge acquired within the university, will affect the daily lives of Montrealers. In the case of today's event, we're excited that this has a global reach and global impact as well. Our mission is to stimulate emerging research on Montreal and Montreal studies, and to unite research being conducted within various disciplines and universities, and to develop partnerships in communities of practice with civil society, with other researchers and practicants, etc., to advance Montreal studies, etc. I would like to also acknowledge the traditional keepers of the territory from which I'm speaking to you today, who are the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. We acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous people whose footsteps have marked this territory where I am now speaking to you from. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where one of our co-hosts, moderators, Jess Rea, is based, which is the University of Virginia. In that case, the traditional custodians are the Monacan Nation, and we therefore pay our respect to their elders, both past and present. I'd like now to introduce the co-organizers and facilitators of the symposium. Anna Branduszewski is a PhD student at McGill University, researching AI governance and privatization of the state. She was previously at the Center for Interdisciplinary Research of Montreal as our McConnell Professor of Practice, where she examined AI policy and funding in Canada. Jess Rea is an assistant professor of data science at the University of Virginia. Before joining UVA, they were appointed as Mellon Fellow at McGill University and Bank of Montreal Foundation Fellow here at the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Montreal. So we're delighted to welcome both Anna and Jess back, as it were, to the center. And I'm very excited to see what the panel brings in terms of insights and lively discussion. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll turn the podium over to Anna and Jess.
Thank you so much, Nick. So we are so excited this day's finally here. Thank you for being with us. And really just to kick it off by saying the symposium emerges an opportunity to connect people, organizations, and resources in the networks that we built over the last decade of work on research, advocacy, and tech policy. Bringing in non-Western and Western perspectives, the panelists will question, challenge, and envision ways that meaningful engagement, meaningful civic engagement with data and AI can flourish and persist even as data and AI become more pervasive in our lives.
Thanks, Nick and Anna. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. Very, very happy to have you here. And we want to hold space for people, ideas, and organizations that often do not have a seat at the tables where most decision-making on data-centric system happens. So the focus on civil society and academia was deliberate and a way to listen to people who have dedicated most of their lives to public interest technology and to the communities. And after navigating various challenging policy and regulatory contexts ourselves, and I over the last years, we joined our efforts here to start this conversation. So the symposium offers some possibilities for engagement, and the public panels are a starting point of a larger process we hope might continue after the day is over. In this second panel, meaningful civic engagement with data and AI, will question the potentialities and limitations of meaningful engagement with data-centric systems in cities and the definition of meaningful itself. And we will also address social movements and community organization as a form of civic engagement, local and regional public interest advocacy in tech, and approaches to civic participation in AI, what they mean for increasing government accountability and regulatory power. And lastly, we also ask ourselves, what can we learn from indigenous perspectives on AI development and use, as well as indigenous data sovereignty, and what is the whole role of data activists in all this. Thanks very much.
Before we get into this great discussion, I'm first going to introduce the panelists. So first we have Caroline Runningwolf. Caroline, née Old Coyote, is Crow-German and dedicated to supporting Indigenous language and cultural vitality. She was raised in USA, Canada, and Germany. Caroline considers it a privilege to now live and learn on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded Indigenous territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations while pursuing her PhD at the University of British Columbia. Caroline's PhD research explores potential applications of immersive technologies, AR, VR, XR, and AI to effectively enhance Indigenous language and culture reclamation. She is also passionate about Indigenous data sovereignty and AI ethics. Next, we have Juan Carlos Lara. Juan Carlos is co-executive director at Derechos Digitales, a Latin American organization working at the intersection of human rights and digital technologies. He has experience as analyst, instructor, and researcher on issues related to data privacy, surveillance, freedom of expression, and access to knowledge in the digital environment. Juan Carlos has a law degree from the University of Chile and a master's degree from the University of California, Berkeley. Next, we have Mitch Spieler. Mitch is based in Montreal, Tiohtià:ke, and works in the Community Technology Program at COCO, the Center for Community Organizations, a non-for-profit whose mission is to help build a more socially just world by supporting the health and well-being of community organizations in Quebec. A political scientist by training, they've done work on gender equity in universities through analysis of employment data and research on reconciling academic, career, and raising children. Mitch has been involved in several local and international feminist media projects and brings a background of ICT trainer, web developer, and executive director of a Quebec community group to the table, as well as a passion for the question, how technology contributes to or can be used to eliminate oppression. Next, we have Renee Cummings. Renee is an AI ethicist and the first data activist in residence at the University of Virginia's School of Data Science and co-director of the Public Interest Technology University Network at the University of Virginia. She is also a criminologist, criminal psychologist, and therapeutic jurisprudence specialist and a community scholar at Columbia University. Renee is on the front line of ethical AI, generating real-time solutions to many of the consequences of AI and the impacts of data on society. Renee is on the board of advisors for Carnegie Council's AI Inequality Initiative and the International Research Center of AI at UNESCO. She's also a founding member of the Springer Journal AI Ethics, on the board of Women in Voice, as well as on the board of Inspired Minds, producers of the World Summit AI. And last but not least, we have Renee Sieber. Renee is an associate professor at McGill University in Montreal. She has over 20 years of experience working at the intersection of civic empowerment and computational technologies. She co-hosts the monthly Community of Practice on AI in Canadian municipalities and researches civic participation on AI.
Now we hear from our panelists. They will have 5 minutes to present their work and main ideas. And after that, we'll have a round of questions from the moderators and panelists, followed by questions from the audience. So please be sure to use the chat or the Q&A Zoom feature for your questions. Et les présentations seront en anglais, mais vous pouvez poser vos questions en français aussi, en utilisant le clavardage ou l'outil de questions et réponses de Zoom, et on va faire la traduction pour les panélistes. Merci beaucoup pour votre compréhension. And the first panelist is Caroline. So thank you so much for being here. Go ahead.
Thank you for having me. And I'm sure I won't fill the 5 minutes, but that'll just leave us more time for questions, right? I just wanted to tell a bit about where my background is. So currently, I'm involved in 2 main projects. One of them is developing a novel automatic speech recognition approach for Indigenous languages, and we're starting with languages of the Wakashan language family, Makah, which is based in Washington State in the United States, and north of that border, Kwakolo, which is mainly based on North Vancouver Island. And the second main project, you heard my PhD research, is about creating a pedagogically and culturally appropriate educational experience that immerses language learners in Kwakwaka'wakw culture while engaging them in the language. And to do that, ideally, it would also incorporate voice AI. As an Indigenous person working with Indigenous topics like that, it's integral that Indigenous data sovereignty and the ethics that's associated with all of this work is, of course, a very important component. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caroline. That was great. And we hope to hear a little bit more afterwards and when we follow up with questions too. So now let's hear Juan Carlos Lara, please.
Thank you very much, Jess. Thank you also, Anna, and thank you to the Center for Interdisciplinary Research in Montreal for hosting me in this session. My background, as you've heard also from the presentation, is from a civil society organization, specifically one that advocates for human rights in relation to digital technologies. So in that capacity, most of the work that I can present or that I can speak about at this stage has to do with what my very capable team is doing, both in terms of our own comparative research and also at designing methodologies for comparative work, the work that other organizations and academics and individuals are conducting throughout the Latin American region. Relevant to this conversation right now, I really want to mention something that is very near and dear to what our work as a civil society organization has been in the past couple of years, which is the work on inclusion and artificial intelligence. It's in ia.derechosdigitales.org. And that tries to analyze several case studies from different Latin American countries where public policy making is also using the tools of artificial intelligence or technologies for algorithmic decision making sold or presented as artificial intelligence for the purposes of conducting decisions in certain sensitive areas. Although we have 4 cases already up there since a year back, we are now conducting additional research through independent researchers on predictive policing and on financial aid, whilst the previous ones were related to social services, employment allocation, health services, and also one specific court of justice in Colombia. To speak very briefly about these experiences before we go into the deeper conversation, we have found that all of these cases presented some commonalities in terms of what the technology was presented as vis-a-vis what they actually were or what they actually do. At the same time, very different levels of public engagement, very different levels of institutional or normative backgrounds. But at the end of the day, what those cases show is that this is, as we can discuss a bit further into the conversation, that these cases still present an opportunity for meaningful engagement towards the future. Even if we understand these as very specific use cases, these are all cases where we try to understand what public policymaking is doing. And from that, we derive what will come after. Unfortunately, after this talk, because we have yet to launch a few extra materials on this that are related to how do we implement in a more participatory and open manner public policies that involve implementation and deployment of artificial intelligence tools. That is to say, where do we find ourselves as citizens involved in the process of deciding which technology is used and for what, and also how are historically marginalized communities in Latin American countries accounted for when these systems may disproportionately target their interests. And I think that that's a big part of what we can talk about a bit later. But at least so far, what we have is that in terms of participation, the experience is rather limited when we try to search, and this is something that is an ongoing work. Good cases, good examples of involvement of public participation in algorithmic decision-making systems. These were few and far between, and most of the examples that we saw either came from English-speaking countries, including a few cases from Canada or the UK, many of them promoted by private institutions as well, and not necessarily replicated in our countries. But I think that these are things that we can discuss a bit further down the line in this conversation. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. Yeah, that was really great. And I'm keeping in mind and on paper your questions for the discussion. Next, we have Mitch.
Yes, thank you to the organizers for allowing me to bring a Montreal, Tiohtià:ke, Munyang local perspective to this discussion. And as much as my perspective is rooted in the social justice and anti-racist Montreal community sector, it is also rooted in the activism of an international feminist grassroots movement. So I want to offer two approaches to the question of civic engagement in data and AI. In the first one, I invite you to view community organizing and social movement activism as a form of civic engagement. From there, I want to explore what the skepticism towards and the critique of AI within that sector is based on. So first, data has historically been used against many communities, particularly Indigenous communities and Black communities. And I'm referring here to the work on Indigenous data sovereignty and to the work of Simone Brown, for instance. Second, several authors and scholars have written about the discrimination and harm that algorithms and AI exacerbate or even create. And I want to name particularly Safia Noble, Joy Bolangwini, and Ruha Benjamin. Third, when community organizations or social movements are confronted with AI, those systems usually do bring an increased amount of surveillance with them. And they often target already over-surveilled communities. Fourth, AI in many cases is inherently conservative. Its predictions are based on past data, and in some cases, they're just a new flashy technology that allows governments to deliver the same old policies and give them an excuse to not do something else. Fifth, especially when it comes to automated decision-making, processes that used to be public and or contestable become private and or protected by private companies' trade secrets. And sixth, the arrival of the AI industrial complex in a city has a considerable impact on local communities. Gentrification, displacement of communities due to spikes in rent, even the face of philanthropy changes. This means there's an impact on which problems get addressed in a city and which not. And there is an impact on whose voices are being listened to when it comes to figuring out how problems should be solved and what the solutions are. These points, among others, explain why the community sector would be hesitant to use some of its already scarce resources to invest in data and AI. As to the second approach, a few words on civic engagement as participation of community organizations and social movements in processes around AI in cities. There is a lack of transparency and access to information on where and how data and AI is applied and what private enterprise interests are connected to them. But more importantly, there is no meaningful participation without accountability. Let's take, for example, the consultations for Montreal city budget. In 2020, over 70% of people participating in the city's pre-budget consultation survey wanted to cut the police budget. The city's budget proposal instead then saw an increase to the police budget and cuts to social housing. The following year, the pre-budget consultation simply no longer included defunding the police as an option. That, together with the fact that police forces all over the country seem to heavily invest into data collection and AI, and some of them in collaboration with Palantir, raises questions on whether meaningful participation aligned with the social justice and anti-oppression values of community organizations is even possible. I want to close with a few questions and thoughts around accountability and on whose terms the civic engagement is happening. I believe it is necessary to address these questions in order for any engagement to potentially become meaningful. First, the past demonstrates that it seems impossible to hold entities that deploy AI accountable, for instance, the police. Second, what happens if accountability and decision-making are not located in the same place? Third, how do we need to reimagine civic engagement when private actors are more powerful than governments and traditional theories of participation fall short? And fourth, debates around civic engagement and AI often focus on a presumed illiteracy of the community sector around these technologies. How can we shift the focus to the illiteracy of the AI industry when it comes to local communities, realities, and the context of their work? Thank you.
Thanks, Mitch. That was awesome. Thanks for bringing these points to an agenda that rarely address these issues. I'm looking forward to hearing more later from all of you about this. And so I'd like to welcome Renee Cummings next. Please, Renee.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and including me in this conversation. And it is such an honor to be on this panel with my colleague, Jess. So Jess, thanks again. So as a criminologist and criminal psychologist and a therapeutic jurisprudence specialist, my work examines AI, data, democracy, decision-making, due process, and trust, examined at the intersection of AI ethics, data activism, criminal justice, policing, national security, surveillance, and the ways in which surveillance technologies are tracking, tracing, traumatizing and terrorizing many of our communities. So I examine the many levels and layers of bias and discrimination and exclusion, marginalization, victimization, and poly-victimization, and other inequities in big data, algorithmic decision-making, AI, and just in new and emerging technologies in general that continue to undermine the development and progress of Black, Indigenous people of color, minoritized groups, vulnerable groups, high needs, underserved and under-resourced communities. Within the context of AI ethics, because I am also an AI ethicist, my work really explores the full dimension of algorithmic decision-making in all industries and sectors, investigating how algorithms could undermine duty of care and frustrate due process because of a lack of due diligence around power, privilege, and the politics inherent in data and the data infrastructure, and how historical data, biased data, and systemic racism baked into our data sets are impacting futures and denying many individuals access and opportunities and resources to build wealth and to define their own legacies. For me, an algorithm is a legacy. An algorithm creates a legacy, and we have got to be very proactive when it comes to the long-term impacts of data and AI on society and the legacies that are being created. So many people call me an AI Jedi because so much of my work looks at justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion in AI and data. And this is so critical to everything that I do because my work seeks to bring that ethical approach to the application and deployment of algorithms everywhere they are deployed. So much of my work is situated within the context of fair, accountable, transparent, responsible, diverse, equitable, and inclusive innovation, in particular, AI we can trust. So the discretionary power of algorithms, due process, procedural justice, these are now all AI black box issues with proprietary rights and intellectual property and trade secrets, the legal protections of algorithms taking priority over protecting civil liberties and civil rights and human rights. So I'm extremely passionate about AI, its power, its potential, its promise, the transformative work we could do with AI and data. But I'm also very protective of our rights, of our privacy, of our security, of our destinies, and of our legacies being created with data and AI. So my work is in the realm of public interest technology, responsible, equitable, and justice-oriented innovation and civic engagement, of course, building trust, public confidence, and providing a space for the legitimate use of technology. So I thank you so much for this opportunity and look forward to engaging you in our question segment.
Thank you so much, Renee. That was really insightful, and I'm jotting some notes down for the discussion. Thank you. Now, last but not least, let's hear from Renee S.
Hi, everyone. So I have 3 questions. 1, what is AI and why AI? So I'm primarily interested in civic participation in tech. I'm particularly interested in subversive technology, but I also do a fair bit of AI in natural language processing, computer vision, and explainable XAI or explainable AI or XAI. Why do I bring that up? Because AI is huge. It ranges from logistic regression to deep neural networks. It's often conflated with spreadsheets, old tech, and with data. So the big challenge for us is what's new, because so much of what we're talking about is not new. These are very durable problems. Okay, why AI in cities? Because it's promised to be efficient. And really, when you talk about efficiency, you're talking about the reduction of labor costs, which is something we should be concerned about. It's often promised to be safer in terms of predictive policing, protecting us from pedophiles. So we have to question the framing of AI as a safety measure for fearful citizens. Importantly, it's seen as a solution to the messiness of democracy. And that's a big problem because it can reduce the concept of meaningful civic engagement to individual privacy protection or check off the box. We had enough of those people in our multi-stakeholder forums, so we're good, right? We were meaningful. Or a passive harvesting of social media, because you don't actually need to talk to the public at all. You just harvest their tweets or Instagram posts and you infer their desires vis-a-vis the city. What is meaningful? As above, one of the complications when we think about civic participation in AI is we think about it vis-a-vis tech policy. But the complication is, so for example, the impacts of predictive policing in terms of false positives. But AI is also being used to intercede in participation and to modernize participation, for example, via chatbots and the passive harvesting that I mentioned. So it's important to separate those two. One notable thing about AI is that it actually can act as a form of anti-participation in terms of surveillance, because AI can do facial recognition technology and can use classification algorithms, for example, to label your sexuality and gender, whether you like it or not. Another challenge is that what do we think of as meaningful in an era when the citizen increasingly views themselves as a consumer and the individual is commodified? So they start to see themselves not only as a person who's consuming things, but also as data. This is bad for meaningful AI because a consumer perspective can view the city government as I don't want to be involved in deliberative democracy. Leave me alone and make government frictionless. Lastly, to what end do we put civic engagement? Often meaningful engagement is about transparency, explainability, as Mitch pointed out, literacy and education. But to what end? Should it stop there? And where's the legal accountability? I'm educated now, so what? What can you do about that? A lot of the reasons that we stop at transparency and explainability is because, oh, tech is so complicated, we can't understand it. So maybe it's just a matter of making sure we're more compliant with the technology. When I think about what is meaningful, I'm thinking about raw and durable political power. I'm not thinking about transparency or literacy. I'm thinking about power in the hands of the people, particularly marginalized people. It is interesting how many people are made uncomfortable, even in the fairness, accountability, and transparency in AI community, to think about political power in these issues. Not process, not the process was successful, but the outcome, an outcome that is lasting. And I should just add to Caroline's point, I mean, often we'll frame AI as negative and harmful, but there are also positive outcomes for AI, like for language preservation. That's it for me.
Thanks so much, Renee. And thanks all of you for your amazing contribution. I think I speak for both of us when I say it's such an honor, and we're so happy to have you here and to learn together. And just to follow up on this meaningful engagement, since you're talking about this, and I think one of the questions that we asked ourselves as well as we're putting all this together was like, does it make sense to talk about meaningful engagement in the first place with this data-centric systems such as AI? And what does meaningful engagement would look like some sort of meaningful, followable engagement here? And if you have like any alternatives to this approach and concept as well. So I would like to hear from you, all of you, whoever. Go ahead, Renee.
So meaningful might be in the details. Defunding the police is a detail. So if we have a sufficient amount of political power, then we could say no facial recognition technology in the city, period. Company X, we have to be able to audit your algorithms to ensure that you do not have a hook into Palantir or to Clearview AI. So you do not have FRT in your tech. So that's where I am at in terms of meaningful. I don't know that it can be answered in the aggregate. It might have to be answered in the details.
Thanks, Carlos.
Thank you. I think I may have raised my hand half a second before Mitch. However, I really want to echo some of the things that Professor Sieber was just saying about raw, lasting political power, because I agree that focusing on the outcome and focusing on how any form of engagement might actually impact the way in which systems are deployed, if at all. I think that it's also important to understand that to limit the idea of meaningful engagement to only a few aspects of a technology that is not going to be questioned is problematic in and of itself. And it doesn't really, I mean, when we speak about, for instance, the case of facial recognition technology in public spaces, where usually organizations like mine and others intervene by litigating it in the public sphere, there are, for many of those, there are a lot of other usages that are not necessarily as salient in their pervasiveness and how harmful they might be. Specifically, I want to speak about one of the examples that we collected, and I will link in the chat because I had not done that before, which is related to the use of algorithmic assistance to allocate social services to children and teenagers at risk. The problem with that is that this replicates, as it was said by my fellow panelists before, an existing policy rather than changing the policy itself. So any form of meaningful engagement that will not tackle the underlying assumptions of that system in terms of why do we allocate services this way instead of having the machine improve the efficiency of a broken public policy is by itself a limited amount of engagement. And I think that as we can further discuss as well, raw political power is necessary in all of the chain, as Professor Sieber was saying too. Why AI here or there is a relevant question that needs to be addressed well before we speak about meaningful engagement in systems or technology that is embedded into systems that reflect skewed or problematic or legacy political settlements, political views that are not necessarily the best use of technology and that definitely do not reflect necessarily where society should go in terms of assisting, providing social services, providing justice services, or other forms of public policy.
Thanks very much. Mish?
I'm just going to be brief about this, but for me, it starts with, meaningful engagement starts with decentering the technology and centering the communities. And centering the complex and urgent problems that exist in the communities, and then talk about that and engage in the problem definition, and not only in kind of checking off and signing off on a solution that often is based on a very ignorant perception of what the problem actually is, and therefore the results can't be good. Whereas if we would start with the problem definition in a way that centers the community we're talking about, then AI could actually be useful, as the example that Caroline maybe hopefully will be able to speak a little bit more to is a good example for.
I'm just going to jump in here. I think, when we think about AI in the city within the context of meaningful civic engagement and public trust, one of the things that we've got to think about is meaningful for who and what is meaningful being defined as. And coming from that criminal justice perspective, coming from a space of working in homicide investigations and gun and gang violence probably for the last 15 years, and working in high needs and underserved communities, there is a culture of distrust in our cities. And that distrust is historic. That distrust is real time. There's a distrust between communities and the police. There's a distrust between communities and the social services, communities, and then child protection. We know in many of our cities, we have some of our highest populations when it comes to undocumented individuals. Many of them, of course, a distrust created between immigration and deportation issues, and particularly in the United States, when we think about the relationship between our undocumented communities and something like ICE. So where there is that culture of distrust, how do we build trust? Because we're adding onto that culture of distrust, another culture of distrust when it comes to data and data collection and data analysis and decision-making by data. And then there's this distrust when it comes to technology and the deployment of technology. And now with COVID-19 and the vaccination and the collection of data, there are other a level of distrust. So there are so many of layers of distrust. When we think about the distrust, we're also adding to that alienation and cultural dislocation and social exclusion. And there's just so much in that space, in that city space. So how do we build this conversation in a culture of distrust? How do we engage communities that are already in spaces of distrust when it comes to government? How do we even build up public trust to have that conversation? So if we want to speak about civic engagement and public trust and the deployment of data and AI, we have got to deal with the distrust that already exists, because the things that communities, underserved communities, high needs, under-resourced, vulnerable communities understand is that lack of trust between themselves and the systems, and knowing that the systems were not built for them, but oftentimes systems are deployed against them. And one of the things we know when it comes to deployment of technology, more of it within the city space is seen to be deployed in a way that is supposed to deliver effectiveness and efficiency, but where is the equity? Where is the democracy? Where is the justice in that deployment? So for us to talk about trust, we've first got to deal with the distrust that already exists. So I just wanted to share that.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Renee, and also Mitch. I think some of what all of the other panelists have said really digs into that question of meaningful needs respect, and it needs relationships. You can't have trust for something if it's this, strange concept that's been forced upon you. And so from my perspective, and I'm sorry, my perspective is not so much about the city as it is just about indigenous communities and those contexts. But from my perspective, the starting point is relationship building, and like Mitch was saying, shifting that focus away from this technology, whether it's an amazing technology or a scary technology, it doesn't matter. It's supposed to be something for the people, right? So we have to start with actually genuinely listening to the people and to the needs, and respecting the answer that we get. And if that answer is no, then too bad. You can't, like I'm again, my context is different, and I was thinking about the informed consent hearings with indigenous communities about maybe building a dam or mining some ore, whatever, and you have these hearings with the community, and it doesn't matter what the community says. The decision was already made. That's not informed consent. That's not genuinely listening and respecting the needs and the wants and the wishes of those communities. And we can see these communities as, indigenous communities in my case, but also communities of other marginalized, historically marginalized groups, whether they're organized as a community or not. So from my perspective, meaningful engagement starts with dismantling that colonial extractivist approach and starting by thinking relationality and building those relations and building trust. And it doesn't work well with capitalism and extractivism, because building relations means time. Building trust means time. and just, investing long-term into those communities and into those relations. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Caroline. I'm just trying to weave through my brain everything that has been said because it's been so relevant and needed and important, and I'm really lucky to be here in a room with you. So just to kind of build on the sort of, distress that Renee brought in around ICE and Palantir, and this layers of culture of distress upon distress, and taking it to, back to her initial point around an algorithm is a legacy. And then from that, building on how we need to look at how we shouldn't build just the systems that are deployed against them and them are marginalized groups, but for them, and also by and with. But it's also about what Caroline just said, which is the need for meaningful, in its definition, to have respect and relationships and relation building. So given that we need time, and given that political power that is durable and raw also needs time, and democracy needs time, and so does participation, what is the role of social movement and community organizations in civic engagement, as well as the local and regional public interest advocacy? What are the best methods or ways for trust building and capacity building? Maybe Caroline, I can pick on you to talk about trust building and capacity building.
Oh, I was going to pick on Juan. Juan Carlos, don't you have
Yeah.
What is the role? Why are you here? Your power to the people and advocacy, right? I mean, isn't that power in the numbers?
Indeed, but there's a small caveat there, that if I knew what is the most effective way, I would be doing that instead of exploring so many different ways of tackling that kind of effectiveness in a more, let's say, trial and error manner, as we have seen here. I think that one of the key problems that we have, and I'm sorry if you wanted to intervene now, Caroline, but I will shut up in a minute. I think one of the key areas in which we are being challenged at the moment has to do with the issue of political imbalance, and probably going a step back to the previous discussion. We have, at least in the Latin American region, far too many instances where trust in politically implemented systems is a non-issue because they can exert power without necessarily having to consult anyone. And countries or governments, even local authorities, might not be necessarily following International Labor Union guidance on consultation of indigenous groups, for instance. And which is against the law, but they are not consulting necessarily, and they are leaving out any kind of engagement in that sense. So the role of social movements, community organizations, and other forms of representation of communities has a lot to do with highlighting interests, has a lot to do with defining the object and defining the area of intervention in which these algorithmic decision-making, automated decision-making, data processing systems might be implemented. But above that, I think there's, depending on the context, there are different challenges in essentially asserting themselves as subjects of power, as a counterbalance to the exercise of power in a more vertical manner by certain authorities. And at the same time, by essentially becoming the relevant actors in many political discussions that tend to omit their perspectives in defending efficiency, efficacy, and probably broader political goals that are not necessarily aligned with that of the communities that will be impacted by these systems. And I think that depending again on context, a lot of that grassroots political work, which exists in other areas, needs to be also asserted with relation to these systems or this way of exercising power by political systems, and therefore to essentially insert themselves in another process that might not be necessarily very much visible to them because of these notions that this is just new technology, but there's nothing really changing, which is, as we probably know, not necessarily the case when these type of technologies are implemented.
I'm just going to jump in there, and I think Caroline raised an excellent point about time. And the question is, do we have time? When we think of the speed and scale, the power and the pervasiveness of AI, and the ways in which we are deploying and designing our new systems and technologies with data, I think one of the critical things would be that we don't have the kind of time that we need, because the impact of data in society and the impact of AI in society has shown us that time is not something that we can count on. What we are seeing is this technology changing communities and changing systems and changing or shifting the hands of power in real time. One of the most critical things that we do need is activism. And as the first data activist in residence at the University of Virginia, that's some of the work that I do, the ways in which we can use data to really redefine our social and cultural and political and economic systems in favor of an equitable and diverse and inclusive approach, an adjusted-oriented approach to innovation. When it comes to what is the blueprint of a successful advocacy or activism approach, that's one of the things that we don't have at the moment. We have different groups trying to come up with these different approaches to engage communities. But while communities are affected and impacted, they are still not engaged, because this conversation is slowly moving out of academia and out of the academic journals. And they're yet to really reach the street corners, the bodegas, right? The barbershops, the hairdressing shops, or the kitchen tables. It's just not there yet. And this is what we have got to do. You know, we have got to put a little rhythm in those algorithms and move them quickly into the spaces that they need to go, because what we are seeing is that when it comes to algorithmic decision-making systems, an algorithm makes a decision about you, and chances are you will never even know what that decision is and when that decision was made. So we have got to really step it up, and we have got to really become a little more, robust and rigorous in our approaches to take those conversations outside of these spaces and really take them into those places. Where do we start? I think we've started. How are we going? I think we have a very robust community of AI ethicists and data activists and just an extraordinary diverse group of individuals working in this responsible innovation and responsible tech space. But these conversations have got to move swiftly. From the criminal justice perspective, you would find that those who have interacted with the criminal justice system, those who've been surveilled, those who've been the victims of predictive policing, those who've been the victims of intelligence-led policing and precision policing, and those who've been on the street corners and become the victim of technology, they understand the conversation, like those who've been misidentified by something like facial recognition. So you find Black and brown persons who are the victims of AI and data, understanding already the impacts of this technology. But I think what is required is an honesty that speaks to the ways in which we are thinking about communities. And I think that honesty is required to really impact the communities that are being affected and are the victims oftentimes of technology and not the beneficiaries of the positives of AI and data.
That's great. Renee Sieber, do you want to comment on this?
I'm always struck by the concept of civil society, that we should be civil. I think that sometimes meaningful participation means rejecting the framework of participation that is offered, and it means not being civil. So we're all very polite here, but we may need to be a lot more radical than we are. Listening to podcasts about Black abolitionists, they were not always polite. And maybe we need to do a little bit of vandalism. I mean, I don't want to shock too many people, but we may need to go back to our roots of community organizations.
Thanks, Mitch.
You know, one of my lessons over the last couple of years in community organizations and also social movements is that there are just some things that can't be rushed. And as much as we would want to catch up with the AI industry around all this, I don't think as social movements and community organizations we ever can or not should even try. This is I think this is a race we'll be losing, because just look at the resources that are there for the AI industry. And so I'm reluctant to say like we need to move fast and, you know, kind of like go into that same rhythm. At the same time, that strategy also, you know, can just be as both Renees, like I'm referring to both Renees, right, have pointed out, like we need to act fast in some ways, but also sometimes maybe that acting fast is just to throw a wrench into some of the mechanics. So we do have the time to actually build, and here I'm referring to Caroline, the relationships and the trust and to actually center again, and I'm coming back to that, to center the communities and the communities' needs and the capacity building. You know, there's this piece of capacity building, as I said, where I think the capacity building needs to happen on the side of the AI industry. And if just like a fraction of the money that goes into the AI industry from governments right now would, you know, like if would go into these other spheres, then we also would have a better situation. And I really do think that we need to have also, especially when it comes to the question of accountability, have the courage to hit pause in some places to figure this out. Like, because like, how do we construct this accountability? I don't think we can just pull out a solution out of our hats. I think it's a complex situation where we need to figure out like, how can accountability actually happen in this context? And that takes time and relationship building. So it's kind of like a mix of strategies or tactics that's probably necessary.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And just kind of jumping off of the throw a wrench in fast, I think that's, in my opinion, that's the answer to the question that Anna gave us at the beginning of this section was, you know, what is the role of social movements and community organizations and advocacy? And that's where I see the role is in throwing in that wrench fast and saying, slow down. Here are groups of people that you are not considering. Here are situations that you need to take into account. And if you just continue doing what you're doing, you're building on existing bias and just enforcing that bias in a different way. Because, you know, what Renee Cummings was saying earlier with the facial recognition, any brown person can, brown or black or person of whatever color, can tell you that they have experience being followed around in a store. And feeling extremely uncomfortable if they leave the store without buying anything, because very likely they're going to be stopped. If they leave the store after buying something, they're going to be stopped, because there is that bias already in the society and in the systems. And it doesn't matter if there's technology or non-technology, if it's humans doing it or the technology just doing it. So yes, advocacy and social movements and community organizations, I think one of their very important roles is to actually amplify the voices of historically marginalized people, and to push those big data corporations, for example, and the AI system holders to even consider including other perspectives. And it's possible. I'll just stop there.
Thanks, Caroline. And I have so many more questions, and I'm sure Anna does this. We usually have more questions than answers anyways, but I would like to give an opportunity for the audience. They asked us a few questions. Some of them are for specific people here. I think we can start with Delise. Asked a question for Mitch. You raised such an important question in your presentation. What happens when decision-making accountability don't happen in the same place? I'm curious to know if you have an answer to your question.
Thank you for that question. I wish I did have like a definitive answer. Like I think I could maybe win a prize with that. I do think though that creating accountability takes time and learning. And so I'm coming back to that piece of, where we need to build something and figure something out and create ourselves the space to actually figure that out. Because anyone who's ever been involved in any type of accountability process knows it's not that simple. And it takes figuring out, and it takes collective work. So, but I'd be curious to hear if others on the panel have ideas around that, how we deal with the issue of accountability and decision making not being in the same space, because like to me the only way I'm actually seeing forward is that that we bring the spaces back together, that it can't just be in two separate places, because in any other area it just means like, if you think of a work situation where you are accountable for stuff but someone else makes the decision in your job, you burn out. And so like this society will burn out as well in the same way, because it's just not possible.
I don't have an answer, so I have as many questions as Mitch does. We hear this in the fairness, accountability, and transparency and AI community in terms of, why are you focusing on local governments or subnational governments at all? Because AI is transjurisdictional, it's global. So you have to go to the European Union or to the World Economic Forum, or you have to go to Facebook, because you shouldn't be talking to governments at all. You should be talking to the private sector. That being said, the New York City's task force, rather the shadow task force report on auditing algorithms in New York City, it wasn't ultimately successful, but it was a huge shock to the private sector. So even though decision-making and accountability are not happening in the same place, when something happens at the local level, it can shock the system. So that's good. Likewise, when the Scottish government put the kibosh on Clearview AI, and then, of course, the head of the Clearview came by as what? Glasgow wants to protect pedophiles because that's what we do with facial recognition technology. So obviously you don't want to protect your children. Yes, you do get that dramatic backlash from companies. At the same time, it shocks the system. So we can we can do things even when accountability and decision-making are not in the same place.
So if anybody doesn't want to add anything else, I can move on to the next question. We're good? Okay. So the next question is from Kat. If we can get the companies to take on policy or programmatic commitments to curbing the worst of AI, how do we track accountability? Is it ensuring a transparent process of engagement with civil society, transparency of the data?
Do you want to answer that, Anne?
Maybe I'm going to pick on Juan Carlos this time because he hasn't spoken in a while and there's a civil society component there that speaks directly to him.
Yeah, can you please repeat the question? I'm not sure I quite understood it.
Sure thing. If we can get the companies to take on policy or programmatic commitments to curbing the worst of AI, how do we track accountability? So like, how do we track private accountability, which is always interesting? And then is it ensuring a transparent process of engagement with civil society, or is it about transparency of the data itself?
Yeah, so a couple of things with the accountability question, because at least from the perspective of the countries where my organization works, there is always the question of whether these systems are located in a way that accountability can be conducted aside from public policy officials. I mean, whether private companies located abroad can be made accountable in a way that is meaningful also to prevent harming effects in the future. And I think that that question also brings about a few other problems which have to do with how to make them accountable when there might not be mechanisms for that. Of course, that question of accountability becomes a lot more salient when we are dealing with foreign companies here. It's sometimes very difficult to make them accountable because of matters of jurisdiction, because of matters of the economic power that they may hold. And at least there is a possibility of accountability that is related to the public sphere. And whether we like it or not, that following ethics guidelines or following any kind of dialogue with civil society organizations, with think tanks and activists that are trying to advocate for ethics, human rights, equity, transparency, etc., that constant engagement might lead to some degree of responsiveness to the concerns that are presented. Of course, that requires either trust or fear, in the sense of because they trust this or that organization, or because this or that community might be trustworthy, and therefore they require that kind of legitimizing effect of being held accountable by their own standards in a way, or by the commonly agreed standards, or because they are afraid of what the public backlash might be, or the loss of potential customers in other countries or in other areas. But that's in a way a less than institutional accountability mechanisms. And one of the problems that we have in civil society is that we are less than trustworthy that those non-institutional, normalized, I mean, not legislated accountability mechanisms are the ones that take place instead of institutional mechanisms, either in the form of agreements with the companies, either in the forms of laws that today may not exist to make them accountable. And in that sense, it might be still too limited. However, it doesn't mean that we have to renounce that possibility. One of the key challenges that we have with accountability is trying to make them accountable without them necessarily having a legal obligation to do this or that, but rather because of their other obligations. there are a lot of studies, especially in legal theory, about the application of international human rights law systems, about whether one company might be sued by a state, right, and so on, whether the jurisdictional matters might be extensive to other forms of harm that might not be part of the procurement agreement, and so on. And I do not think that we should renounce any of those pathways towards accountability, including in terms of, as I was saying, fear of public relations, backlash, loss of clients, and other forms of that. But I think that that's a big question that is not necessarily about rules as much as at this moment norms, and hopefully towards international standards that can be made accountable regardless of frontiers as well.
I'd just like to add there that, the question is whether or not auditing and impact assessments and a risk management approach to AI will deliver the kind of accountability that's required. And I think what we're realizing is that they won't deliver the kind of accountability that's required. So how do we bolster and fortify civic engagement to be part of that accountability? And those are the types of strategies that's required. And I think it's also, for me, about really organizing politically around our data, in the sense that we need to lift up communities as producers of knowledge, and just not producers of data. That data is knowledge, and really getting those community voices involved in that discussion about accountability, because at the moment, I think we all can appreciate that the law is always lagging behind innovation, and it is between that space where those loopholes are created. So we find out about accountability pretty late, when things have already happened. We're now trying to come up with the strategies to deploy some sort of regulations, or some sort of ways in which we can regulate what has happened. I know from a crisis communication perspective, because I've worked in the public sector within the context of AI and data as a crisis communication specialist. You find private companies think about their reputations. They think about media expose. They think about the ways in which legal can probably protect them from an accountability crisis. But it's so much more than that when we think about the long-term impacts of data and society, and how communities are really feeling the devastating impacts of the ways in which we are deploying AI at the moment.
Thanks, everybody. We have so many other questions, but unfortunately we do not have more time. So thanks for the questions, and I will proceed to say thank you very much for all our wonderful panelists today. It's such a pleasure to be here and share this space and learn from you. And we know how tired we all are, so we really appreciate your contributions here. And so this conversation will be continued in an open access publication featuring short essays from our panelists and roundtable participants, and it's going to be available later this year. We don't know yet when, in 4 languages, licensed under a Creative Commons license. And I need to proceed also to say thank you to our organizers and funders. The symposium was made possible by the Center for Interdisciplinary Research on Montreal and the UVA School of Data Science, with general support from the McConnell Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And thanks to our amazing CREAM team for making this happen: Audrey, Elisa, Ophélie, Julie, and Nick, who opened the event for us today. So thanks very much for being here and for everything.
Thank you. Take care, all of you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.